Hello and welcome to an analysis of Fugue number 11 from Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. This is the Fugue in F major. In this presentation, I'm assuming that we already know the basic underlyings of fugue. What makes up an exposition, the alternations between episodes and middle entries that occur within the developmental or modulatory region, the basic structure. Here we're going to be looking at some details and some exceptions to some of these basic understandings of fugue. So I'll be spending more time on that than I will on explaining specifics about the overall structure, though of course we will cover that. So first let's go ahead and take a look at our subject material. Few things to note about it. Let's note, of course, the melodic construction. We have a very nice and clear high point and low point that make a seventh. So this works very nicely, making sure that we have an engaging subject. We, of course, start with some eighth notes. We have what I feel is a clear head motive. This idea here, this opening circle. Bum, ba, dum, bum, ba, before we change the idea and we head sort of towards the body area. Then we have a sort of tail. We arrive on what I feel is an implication of a cadence. Once we hear that scale degree 3, that's sort of our cadential implication of an imperfect authentic cadence there. And then we continue with a sort of tail. So we have our head motive, our body, and our cadence and tail connecting us to the answer. A few other things that I want to point out about this subject is what I feel is some clear elements of compound melody. Specifically, I want to look at the downbeats of each measure and see how they... I know some of those colors get a little bit ugly. Let's use some arrows here. Or just indicate the scale degrees. There's a D, which is scale degree 6 in F, C, which is scale degree 5, B flat scale degree 4, A scale degree 3. So there's a little compound melody that emerges. Built on just a descending scale. That will come into play later, but it's worth noting that even with some of this florid 16th note motion, Bach often bases his melodies on very clear descending, not necessarily descending scales, but very clear compound melodies. In fact, in some ways, this is the same compound melody that we heard in the C minor fugue. It's the same sort of melodic skeleton. 6, 5, 4, but this time in major and with a completely different sort of contour. And of course, this is one of the things that Bach's going for in these pedagogical works, to show us how much is possible with just one simple idea. Let's take a look at this answer as we go on. Heading towards C major, of course, we start in F, we're on 1, we head towards C, and we know that we're there because we have these prominent B naturals. In fact, one that trills for an entire measure. Now let's take a look. Is this a tonal answer or real answer? Well, we know right away. We see that instead of a step, C going to D, we have a leap, F going to A. So this is a tonal answer. And if you, sorry, eraser got a little bit big there. If you go back and take a look at my real and tonal answer presentation, you'll see how Bach comes up with this. Basically, you'll note that scale degree 5 here is answered by scale degree 1 here, that's the change that's taken place. If we were to transpose that C up to a G, the answer would sound like this. And the whole passage would sound like this. This is what it would sound like if there were a real answer. It sounds rather stilted, a little bit funky. The fact that we start on scale degree 1, though, echoing or reversing what we had before where we started on scale degree 5, makes it feel like we're in F for just a little bit longer, helps smooth out this transition to C major. So answering scale degree 5 with scale degree 1 makes a lot of sense. And you'll see that this answer works exactly as I lay it out in the subject and tonal answer presentation. So go back and take a look at that if that is at all confusing. So this, the nice thing about this is even though we had that one adjustment, we still have the same structure. We still have the same compound melody that's happening here. If we think in C major for a second, A is going to be scale degree 6, G scale degree 5, F scale degree 4, E scale degree 3. So if we're in C major, we get those. Still the same outline of that subject material. We've got a little bit of voice crossing for some of this here. Proof that Bach does indeed break the rules sometimes. And of course, if you watch my Fugue exposition composition walkthrough, we had some voice crossing there. I feel it's a little bit ameliorated because that we do see Bach using it sometime. Something to not use all the time. Here we see it present in only part of the subject, but it does occur from time to time. So we have moved to 5. We have moved to C major. So we need to find our way back to F. Our next subject entry is going to start here, where the next voice enters. So let's see if there is a bridge. The subject itself is 1. Oops, let's get ink you can actually see. 1, 2, 3, 4 bars long. So let's see what happens after this subject. This is bar 1, bar 2, bar 3, bar 4. So there's a bar of material that is not accounted for before our next subject enters. Subject, answer, subject. And so there's a bar of material here, which is basically going to be our bridge. Proof that bridges can be very short indeed. Just enough to help us feel that we're heading back towards F. A few things that help us feel that we're heading back towards F, these B flats. So we have a bar of a trill B natural, then the subject's tail, and then a little bit of a bridge. Then we go on for the start of our next subject entry. That continues here, down here, and of course we still have all those elements: scale degree 6, 5, 4, 3. Now that we have the third voice entering, we can tell whether there is a counter subject or not. So we're going to take a look at the material that followed the initial subject. I'm going to highlight it in green, this material here, and we're going to see if that material reappears. That's what's going to let us know if we have counter subject material. Let's take a listen to this green highlighted material. So we need to see if that appears again. Let me play from the bridge now. Now, if you listen for that trill, it's a dead giveaway. Of course, we have that trill again here, and if we follow this material through, we see that it does really appear to be this sort of counter subject material. Let's take a listen from bar 10 in the soprano voice. That matches our previous green We don't have the exact same pickup, but that's okay. In general, it is mostly the same. And then we have some free counterpoint in the middle voice, just sort of fleshing all of this out, giving us the rest of the chord numbers we need. And this is our exposition up unto this cadence right there, this IAC. So that is our expo. So let's take a listen to that. There's our IAC. And now we continue onwards until we hear a fugal entrance again. So let's see what happens. Now, if your ears perked up at this moment right there, you would be wise in having them perk up there, because this is our first middle entry. Let's go ahead and get a finer point pen here. So this is middle entry 1, and here is our subject up here. We're going to go ahead and curtail that. That means this material that happened before it was episode 1. Let's take a listen to what that episode consisted of. Essentially what we had was some sequential material, this sort of idea, sequenced up several times. And a gradual move towards C major, made very clear by that B natural. But Bach doesn't stay in C major for long. The presence of the B flats and the fact that this is the original subject material shows that we are back in F major. Let's take a listen to this middle entry. Sorry for a few hesitancies and wrong notes there. Several things to point out. First, let's highlight all the subject entries we can find. We'll highlight them in yellow, regardless of whether they're subjects or answers for right now. Here is number 1. Now, here is the next one. And another one comes in here. And another here. So we actually have 4 entries here. Before we talk about the number of entries, though, and hone in on that, I want to point out the tonal implications here. First, we're starting with, let me get purple because that's what we were using before. First, we're in F. Then we go to C, made possible by those B naturals. We head back to F and we stay there for a little while. Oftentimes, composers might expand on these initial tonal areas. These are the same tonal areas that we had at the beginning of the fugue, the tonic and the dominant. When we have that happen, particularly as an early middle entry, this is sometimes referred to as a counter exposition. Mainly, it acts as sort of an extra exposition. There are a variety of reasons why a composer might do this, particularly in longer fugues. This might be to give the listener the sense of the opening tonic and dominant areas so that we have those very clear in our minds. But in this case, Bach is really starting to pave the way for something new. Now, it should probably come as no surprise that we have a different order of entries before. There's no real color that I haven't used yet, but before we had middle and then top and then bottom for our voice entries. Here we have top, then middle, then bottom. Bach is showing off his ability to do invertible counterpoint here. But there's another thing that's going on. Let's take a look at these last two entries here. I'm going to highlight this one a little bit more, and I'm going to highlight the one above it in a slightly different color, just so that we see very clearly what's happening. Because remember that we counted out the number of measures that this subject took up. This took up 4 measures. 1, 2, 3, 4. However, at this moment here in the second measure, we actually have another subject entry beginning on top of the original, on top of the subject that came before it. This is called a stretto, Italian for tight. So here we have a tight entry. So this stretto is basically an overlapping entry of the subject material. This, of course, can be used with an answer as well. But the subject material here, one voice begins the subject material before another voice has finished it. Now, how does this work? How does Bach know that this is going to work? Well, let's go back to what we know about the underlying structure of this fugue subject, namely looking at the compound melody that's created and outlining it. We start with scale degree 6, then 5, then 4, then 3. Let's outline those scale degrees in these two subjects. So there's 6, 5, 4, and then 3. Now let's do the same up here. Here's 6, 5, 4, and then down here we have 3. Now let's take a listen to what's happening on those strong beats. I'm going to really zoom in here so that we see. I'm just going to focus on these two voices. Scale degree 6, 5, 6, when we look at the intervals that are being formed, we see that these structural moments, these downbeats, are very cleverly planned so that we have parallel thirds at the beginning. So the D and the B flat move next to a C and an A. We then have a tritone, a diminished fifth, that's going to resolve on the next beat to a third in this moment. So if we were to just play the skeleton notes of these two subject entries, D, C, D and B flat, C and A, E and B flat, F and A, we'd hear very tightly controlled dissonance control. Or with those two voices, works very, very nicely, even with some extra counterpoint on top. And then we're off to our next episode. So this opening sort of counter exposition, in this first middle entry group, certainly serves to help us feel that we are still in the tonic and dominant area. But it also helps to introduce this idea that Bach wants to show us, that this subject is capable of stretto, and very cleverly so. And we'll see Bach expand on this as we continue. So at this cadence, at the start of the fourth system, we do have a little bit of a suspension up here, but we're still going to count it a little imperfect authentic cadence. We start our next episode. This is our episode 2. So what we're going to be listening for is our next subject entry to indicate where the next middle entry comes in. So here's from the start of the fourth system, slowly. Now, there's a big cadence that occurs right there. Let's go back and talk about things that we've heard. If your ears perked up right after measure 35, then they were right in doing so, because we have some subject entries. Let me highlight each of them in a different color. We've got one that happens in the uppermost voice, one that happens in the middle voice, and one that happens in the lowermost voice. Let's listen to these. Let's start with the blue highlighted one that happens right after measure 35. So, there's our subject material. We are now in the key of D minor. We have B flats and C sharps, so we're clearly in D minor here. Let's listen to the green highlighted subject entry. Basically the same thing without a tail. And the purple highlighted entry. With a little bit longer tail and a movement towards a cadence there. Now, as you have probably noticed, these overlap each other. We have moments of overlap here. We have moments of overlap here, as different colors overlap each other. So we have stretto, but it's not just single stretto. It's not just one. It's not just two voices that are strettoing, but it's all three voices. So we have stretto here between the upper two voices, and then we'll have stretto here between the lower two voices. Bach is really wanting to show off the fact that this subject is capable of that. Let's go ahead and mark in the formal areas. So we have this next middle entry area, middle entry 2, happening at the pickup to 37. You could call this a middle entry group if you want. It is a group of middle entries, but remember, it's still labeled with the same numbers there. It's worth noting that there are some motives that are present here. We do hear this little sort of head motive here, right at the pickup to 35. That's not an actual subject entry, though. I would just label that as an X motive if we wanted to label that. So this episode 2 seems to be sequencing downwards. If we look at that at the start of the fourth system. Moving towards a half cadence in D minor in 6. And then we have this long pedal point, emphasizing some tension here that wants to resolve. We want to resolve to D at some point. Here's from the start of episode 2, so we hear what this sounds like. Now, even though we have this bar of extra material after the blue line, the purple line ends, after the last subject entry ends, I would count that measure 45 as part of that middle entry because it's just this cadential material that is tacked on to the end. Now, you might also be able to hear that we seem to be implying a little bit of a hemiola here, like we saw in the D minor invention. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, we have 1, 2, 3, boom. And I think that's something important to feel when we are in the midst of a triple time piece, especially these imitative pieces, which just seem to go on and on and on. We want to hear this punctuation, this cadential punctuation here. So being aware of that as we listen to it, analyze it, or play it is very, very useful. Now, let's take a listen to see what comes next. What is Bach up to after this perfect authentic cadence in D minor? Hopefully you heard another big cadential moment here, and you probably picked out some subject entries as well. Let's go ahead and highlight them. We'll use similar colors to what we did last time. We start here in the bass voice, and we continue in green in the middle voice, and we continue in blue in the uppermost voice. Now I'm just going to play those subject entries. Excuse me, I won't use blue. That was supposed to be purple. Let's go ahead and make sure that we are color coordinated today. There we are. Let's take a listen just to those subject entries. I'm not going to play the other counterpoint. So this is starting after the cadence in D minor. Excuse me. You're probably picking up that we have another stretto. If we highlighted where the voices, where the subject entries overlapped, we'd highlight that like so. So that we have stretto between the lower two voices, and then stretto between the upper two voices. It's basically the reverse of what happened in middle entry 2. And of course, we should label this now as middle entry 3. I label this as middle entry 3 because we've had a clear cadence. There's a clear demarcating point. There's a clear demarcating point between middle entry 2 and middle entry 3. So we want to be aware of that and honor that in our labeling. Bach is also taking a different strategy here. Before, in middle entry 2, the voices went down, or the subject entries went down, the order of subject entries. Now the order of subject entries is going up. Bach again is showing us his supreme use of invertible counterpoint, made possible by the fact that the structural elements of these subject entries use imperfect consonances. If we go back to the underlying ideas, going from scale degree 6 to 5, and then overlapping, we had thirds, a tritone, and then a third. If we invert that, it becomes sixths. So that if we had the D in the bottom, for instance, so that we'd have like that, we'd have parallel sixths if we use the invertible counterpoint, which is exactly what he's implying here. But there's one other wrinkle that's happening. Let's take a listen to the D minor subject in middle entry 2. Now here is the G minor. Now we have E flats and F sharps. Let's take a listen to this G minor subject. So what's happening here? There's some extra 16th notes going on. Before we had several eighth notes, a 1 and a boom, and then an eighth note on the next beat. Boom. Bum ba dum bum ba yum bum 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 ba da da dum dum ba. Now, however, once we get to bar 3, 1, 2, 3, instead of an eighth note, we have an ornament. We have some 16th notes. Bach is letting things percolate. Note how Bach has moved through this fugue like a teacher. The initial exposition shows us our basic material. The first middle entry, the counter exposition, brought in a single use of stretto, but still in our home key areas. Once we got to middle entry 2, we started piling on the strettos. Now that we're in middle entry 3, we pile on the strettos again going up, but now we are also ornamenting this initial subject. So things are starting to change a little bit. Bach is showing us all the potentials that this subject holds. And once again, he brings us to a firm cadence here in G minor. Let's take a listen to middle entry 3 again. Again, you would not be wrong if you heard a hemiola here. Very common in this triple time to have these strong hemiola cadences. There's even a little augmented second here. I think Bach just wants a little bit of extra spice as he goes into this cadence. Highly ornamented there. Now, we start working our way back to F major. So we begin working our way back to F once we hit this big cadence. So we should mark this as the end of our middle entry 3 and the start of our episode 3. So this episode seems to be working around a circle of fifth sequence. We have G minor, then C major, then F, then B flat. So it's actually very cleverly achieved. These middle notes are basically our passing tones between the root and the third of each chord. There's a little bit of a tonicization here. We sort of have a 5, 7 of 4 that leads us to B flat. C, F, 5 of 4, then B flat. This movement towards B flat actually is very clever. We head to B flat, but then the E naturals brighten things up as we move back to F. And again, he gives us this little B flat. We seem to be going back and forth between the subdominant and the tonic here, again and again, but that E natural keeps brightening things up as we go along. But it creates this wonderful sensation as we have this rising scale, which rises from the depths. G, A, B flat, C, D, E, F, G, A, B flat. Then it continues in the next bar, C, D, E, F, G, A, continuing on up until here. So this episode really takes us through the entire texture of the keyboard here. Not the entire texture, but a lot of it. Now, if you're listening for a subject entry, you might catch it, but it's a little bit hidden. Let me highlight it for you here. Now let's take a listen to what I've highlighted. If you caught it, it's probably because you were listening for that large leap. That's the same that we had at the beginning, the C down to the E natural. And it's also made clearer by the fact that we have that eighth note here. However, all the other eighth notes have disappeared. The eighth notes have turned into some ornamented 16th notes. Again, Bach is teaching us some possibilities here. He started ornamenting the subject in middle entry 3, and that ornamentation has sort of infected this final entry, or final entries, depending on how you analyze it. So we have this sort of ornamentation of the initial subject. It's worth noting that the motive itself is identical to the ornamentation that happens later on. This is the same ornamentation that was happening here in middle entry 3. It's the same sort of motive. But again, it still is just emphasizing this underlying core material. We're still going scale degree 6 to 5 to 4 to 3. Those ornaments are just adding some extra flash on top of it. So this is a nice way to sort of integrate all these ideas that Bach has been working with. Now, depending on how you analyze it, you might hear another subject entry, another hint of a stretto down here. It's a bit of a stretch, but it does seem evident that Bach is at least wanting us to hear this as some part of the X motive. That leap down a sixth, then going upwards, and then and doing so in a stepwise fashion with some ornamented material beforehand really feels very much like that subject material. It may not be enough to call it a subject. I don't think I would, but it's definitely enough to give us the feel of a stretto going on, especially with all this ornamented material. If we were just listening to it, we would be hard-pressed to tell for certain if, with everything passing by, whether a subject had entered or whether it was just X material. So I would label this then our final entry, starting here. Sorry, that's a little bit hard to read as I get down to the bottom of the page here. Let's rewrite that. Final entry. And then once we reach this moment here, this little IAC, I'd call everything that happens after that our coda. We have a cadence and then some closing material. It's worth noting that that closing material again uses this ascending scale that we saw used in episode 3, and above it we have a sort of ornamentation of that scale. It's worth noting that if we zoomed in here, we'd see a lot of 16th notes accompanying that scale, but every beat is actually a third. F to A, G to B flat, C to A, B flat to D, E to C, F to D, and then E to G. So all that material, just ornamentations of thirds. Sort of reverse escape tones, or maybe neighbor group sort of figures that are highlighting, ornamenting that progression in the outer voices. And then finally a PAC on a strong beat in our home key. Now it is worth pointing out again that we have a bit of a hemiola here. There we go. If we listen to that bass voice, it becomes very clear. even with the wrong note that I played. Let's add in the middle voice. This tie over really giving us the dead giveaway that this is a hemiola. When we have that tie over at a cadence, it really gives us the feeling of that hemiola. So feeling that hypermetrical slowdown, those breaks that are put on by the use of this hypermetrical dissonance, really helps to bring this to a close. So again, Bach basically giving us an essay here in the structural background of melody. Here we have just this opening idea, 6, 5, 4, 3. And what can be done with that? First, Bach takes it and gives us the hint of a stretto in middle entry 1, builds up to a big stretto in middle entry 2. In middle entry 3, reverses the order of the voices and begins to ornament it. And in our final entry, brings it to sort of a supreme ornamentation before bringing us back home with that again, ornamenting this idea of parallel thirds in our cadence. So Bach very much acting as the teacher here, showing us how to ornament underlying structural functions of melody to create a really engaging structure. Let's take a listen through as I narrate it. I'll be sort of stopping and starting and describing what's going on. Here's our exposition. Tonal answer. A bridge. Then our subject. We now know that there was a counter subject, and we are in episode 1. Then middle entry 1, starting with the uppermost voice, acting as our counter exposition. Middle voice, moving towards C. Our lowest voice, subtle stretto in our middle voice. Episode 2, moving us to D minor. A little sort of Phrygian half cadence here. Middle entry 2, starting with the uppermost voice. Stretto. Lower voice entering, still in stretto. Hemiola. And cadence, move to G minor. Stretto and ornamentation. Hemiola, cadence, then moving upwards through the texture. Circle of fifths, moving us back to F. Tonicization of B flat. Then back to F. Our final subject entry, ornamented. Scales going up. And there's our PAC. One last note, it's not at all uncommon to hear the emphasis on the subdominant as we move towards the end of a piece, a technique often used in the common practice era to sort of chill things out. The leading tone, that E changed to an E flat. And so whereas the E leads us upwards and has a lot of sort of excited energy, the E flat leads us downwards and has some sort of chilled out energy. So it's very common to hear the tonicization of 4, in this case B flat, to sort of chill things out as we move towards the end of the piece. And there it is, Fugue number 11, the Fugue in F major from Well-Tempered Clavier 1, introducing us to some interesting ideas in fugal writing. The stretto, the counter exposition, and also ornamenting and slightly changing the subject as we go through a piece. I hope this helps you analyze, understand, perform, and write fugues as you go on to your own studies in counterpoint.